Right. So thank you everyone for being here with us today. Really great to see everybody. Our webinar for today is all about civility, and our official title is Civility at Work: Who Gets to Be Heard and Who Gets Silenced? What we're really going to do is do a little bit of a deep dive into examining how civility is shaped by power and privilege and what that really means for equity at work. So before we dive in, for any of you who've joined in our webinars in the past, you know the routine. I'm going to do a really quick introduction for myself. If I have not had the pleasure of interacting with you before, my name is Felicia. I'm one of the co-founders of Inclusion Geeks, and our mission is to help workplaces work for everyone. I am based out in Western Massachusetts on the edge of the Berkshires, the traditional lands of the Nipmuc and Pocumtuck peoples. And for anyone who's out my way, it's a particularly gray and rainy day today. We are fully in fall, but really glad to be here with all of you today. And I know we've got folks from all over the country, so the weather hopefully is maybe a little bit different where you are. But we're not here to talk about weather. We're here to talk about civility. So before we jump on into that topic, a couple other quick things I want to review with you. First, here's a couple different ways that we can engage together during our hour in this webinar today. So the chat is the best place to share any questions, any comments, any issues that might come up for you. My business partner, Rachel Murray, is also on today. And so if there's any logistical questions, especially or tech issues, please feel free to ping Rachel directly, but I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat as well. I love questions, and we'll have some dedicated time at the end for questions. So make sure you pop those in the chat along the way. We will have that Q&A section, as I mentioned, and so we'll have a chance to either share during chat, or you can also unmute yourself. And so if that's the case, just please use the raise hand feature when we get there. And we do have closed captions available for today. If you find them helpful, they're there for you. If they're a little bit of a distraction, you can simply use your own tools to turn them on and off on your end. So it's a little bit of a logistical stuff there. But before we get into civility, I just want to quickly name that we have two different heritage months, or actually it's more than two, but there's a couple main heritage months that September actually brings to us. And the first one is very personal for me. It's Deaf Awareness Month. And the reason this is personal is because I am partially deaf. I do wear hearing aids. That's why closed captions are really helpful for me, because sometimes I don't catch everything that someone is saying. And so one positive that this way of engaging virtually has brought up for me and for others is that it's a lot easier to sometimes follow a conversation. Really quickly, just a bit of history here. The International Day of the Deaf was first celebrated on September 28th, 1958, and it was established by the World Federation of the Deaf. Over time, this recognition was expanded beyond just that day to a full week, which is now known as the International Week of Deaf People, and that's traditionally held annually during the last full week of September. But today, many folks, including myself, also recognize the entire month of September as Deaf Awareness Month. And we use this time to promote greater understanding, visibility, and inclusion of deaf people and deaf communities. There is a theme every year, and the theme for 2025 for the Week of Deaf People is No Human Rights Without Sign Language Rights. And so I fully support this. I do not speak sign language myself, but I am hoping to learn more in the future. So I just wanted to name that because it's a part of my identity that's really core and central to me and impacts some of what I bring to my work. In addition to Deaf Awareness Month this month, we also have Hispanic Heritage Month, or there's actually been a bit of a movement recently to reframe or rename Hispanic Heritage Month to Latino, Latina, or Latine Month. And so that's a whole other discussion for another topic, another webinar, but just wanted to name that because there is discussions around whether or not this month needs to shift in terms of how we're naming it. But September 15th marks the beginning of what we're currently calling National Hispanic Heritage Month. And this is a time for us to reflect on and celebrate Hispanic and Latinx heritage and culture. This recognition began in 1968 as Hispanic Heritage Week, just like with Deaf Recognition Week. It was later expanded to a month-long celebration about 20 years later, and the chosen dates here have significance because they coincide with the anniversaries of independence for several different Latin American countries, including Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Mexico, and Chile. So I always like to start off with a quick recognition of whatever Heritage Month we are in because it is a quick and easy way to practice inclusion right away. And that's what we're all about here at Inclusion Geeks. So once more, if you're just joining, feel free to keep your hellos coming in the chat, but let's get into the topic for today, which is all about civility. Now, I'm going to start off with a question for you all. And if you have any answers or thoughts, please feel free to put those in the chat. But my question that I'm going to start off with is, what is civility? And guess what? We're probably going to have 10, 20, 100 different definitions. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about civility, both currently and what it could be like. So if you have any thoughts on your own around what civility is, whether it's a definition, even some keywords, some language, anything that's come up for you, please feel free to share that in the chat. But what I'm going to start off with is a little bit of a more traditional definition here. And the traditional definition, which I'll share in just a minute, is really kind of relates to the fact that this issue or this discussion of workplace civility is not a new one. I don't know about you all, but for me, this terminology, civility, has really kind of come to the forefront a lot more, especially in the last couple of years. But it's not new. It has popped up recently in spaces where previously we may have been discussing topics like social justice, anti-racism, DEI. But typically, these kinds of discussions used to be viewed as a way for employees, especially in a workplace context, to come together and build bridges, align along shared values and workplace commitments. But now it's seen as maybe more of a vehicle for division. And the reality is that the backlash is real, and civility, or whatever we're referencing with this terminology, civility, is here to take the place of what we may have been talking about just a few years ago. So here's what's often taught when we are discussing civility, especially civility at work. And I want to be really clear, this is the main lens that I'm using today when I'm talking about this topic, is through a workplace lens. So this is what we're typically talking about. The definition here, which I'll read off the screen, is that respectful and courteous behavior exhibited by individuals towards their colleagues in the workplace. It involves treating others with dignity, showing appreciation for their contributions, and refraining from any behavior that may be perceived as rude, aggressive, or disrespectful. So this particular definition is from a paper called Advancing Workplace Civility, a systematic review and meta-analysis of definitions, measurements, and associated factors that was published in Frontiers in Psychology in 2023. And that paper, just in case anyone's a research nerd like me, really was synthesizing a lot of existing research on workplace civility by defining it, identifying some common measurement tools, and outlining some strategies. So if anyone's interested in that, happy to share that later on. But just before I move on, just curious, let me know in chat if you want to. Does this land with you? Is this something similar to what you've been either taught or experienced when you've been thinking about workplace civility? And again, this is the traditional definition here. So if this aligns with something that you were expecting to hear when you popped on this morning, put a +1 or just a plus in the chat. If this is something that you weren't, or even, yes, a thumbs up emoji is great too. If it's something that you were like, oh, I wasn't really expecting this, put a dash or a 0 in the chat and let me know, or use some kind of emoji as well to let me know. All right, so I'm seeing stuff come through. Yes, people are like, yes, this is what I expected. +1s, +1s. All right, I'm not seeing anyone be like, nope, this is not at all what I was expecting. What is happening, Felicia? All right, so we're all pretty much on the same page. Traditional definition. And to kind of just double click on this a little bit, this is typically what we're taught, especially in a workplace context. We're taught that civility means that we need to be respectful, we should be polite, we should assume good intentions, we should avoid conflict. I don't know about you all, but I've definitely been taught in my working experience that, oh, conflict is bad. We should keep it professional. And I'm putting professional in quotes here because, again, what does that mean? That's another topic that we'll put a pin in for now. Don't raise your voice, especially in a workplace context. Smile, nod, be positive. Focus on harmony, not tension. Don't rock the boat. And if any of those sort of descriptions also align with what you've experienced or what you've been taught, feel free to keep those +1s or emojis coming. So this is what we're often taught that this is how to be civil or this is what civility means. But this is not the full picture. And here's what's often missing in the civility conversation. So, what's typically missing from my point of view is, well, first of all, who's defining this? Who gets to define civility? Who gets to define what respect is or what professionalism is? And a lot of times when you start to dig into this, you start to see that, well, it ties back to certain concepts that we'll talk about in just a minute in this webinar around power dynamics, identity groups, who is a dominant group represented in an organization, who holds tenure, who holds sort of that power and whatever that might look like for you. So those are people who tend to get to define these concepts. Norms often reflect a more limited worldview. These norms that we're putting in place, that we're tying to the definitions of these words, often reflect dominant standards. Now, again, this is going to be where, depending on where you all are dialing in from, those dominant norms or those dominant standards might be different. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm based in the United States on the East Coast. This is where I grew up, and this is where I've raised my family's here, and our roots are here. So this is my westernized point of view. So especially here in the US, the dominant standards tend to align with white male westernized standards. If you're dialing in from somewhere outside the US, somewhere that's maybe, Europe, Asia, wherever else it might be, those standards probably will look different. But again, it's around who holds that power and what do those norms reflect. Tone and emotion can be viewed through biased lenses. And so a lot of times when we're talking about being civil at work, we're taught, as I mentioned earlier, don't raise your voice, or I didn't like the tone of voice you answered me in, right? But again, how are we analyzing that? And a lot of times this is where the lenses that folks are using might have bias or assumptions built into them. There could be valid anger, grief, dissent that has validity and should be recognized, but tends to get shunted to the side sometimes because we're trying to be nice or we don't want to feel uncomfortable. And there's a need for accountability, not just harmony. And so those are things that I find tend to be typically more, or I should say, less represented in the discussion when we're talking about civility. And this is what typically ends up being left out of the conversation. So, again, sit with that for a moment. Let me know what you feel in the chat if there's anything missing from your perspective. And we're going to have a Slido coming up in just a second. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, this is a tool where you can use a device like your phone to grab a QR code and share with me your thoughts. If for some reason it's not working for you, you can share your thoughts in chat publicly or privately. But heads up, grab your device if you have it handy, and I'm going to pull up the Slido because I want to hear some of your thoughts. So here's my question for you. Have you ever been labeled as uncivil or something similar to that terminology for expressing yourself at work? If so, what did that moment teach you about power at work? So we'll take a couple minutes and just give you a chance to all type because I know this is the part of being on virtual where I can't see you all typing furiously on the back end. But let me know what you think. And if you haven't had this experience, that's valid too. So also feel free to share that in the Slido. Quickly, from a logistical perspective, if you're having any issues getting that QR code working for you, you can go directly to slido.com and use the code 6166944, and that should be able to pop you in here. So I'm seeing some answers starting to come through. So let's see, we've got yes, no, no. All right, so already we got a little bit of differences here. And again, not surprised to see that because we have, let's see, we have about 30 people on today's webinar, and there will be differences that pop up because we had 30 individual experiences here. And for some of you, you might be thinking, yes, I had some kind of experience, but I don't necessarily feel comfortable sharing that in a public webinar with strangers, and that's completely fine too. So as always, only share what you feel comfortable sharing. And if there's something that you wouldn't want to share with all of us, do not feel pressured to do that. All right, seeing some more answers come through here. So this person said, not uncivil specifically, but I have been labeled aggressive. Same. I feel that. Yes, it taught me to learn which battles to fight, and that standing up for what was right got me perceived as angry. Exactly, right? So that valid response being labeled as something that's disruptive. Let's see what else we have here. Yes, I was taught that my speech needed to be policed. Not me personally, but someone at a branch with a lot of challenging patrons is constantly brushed off when they submit incident reports with dangerous situations, violence, biohazard. It makes me lose faith in upper management. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That sounds really difficult. And again, to the point, this is valid, right? I've also been labeled aggressive and possibly not a culture fit. Yes, so if you've attended any of our webinars in the past, you know that when we talk about things like bias, for example, culture fit sometimes is a code word for not being like everybody else, essentially. All right, let's see what else we have here. Calling out white supremacy makes people uncomfortable, but why is that my problem? Good question. Yes, told to only go through the right hierarchical structures. No, but aggressive and curt, been labeled as aggressive and curt. And I see that there's one person who's like, oh, I'm not able to get in. So sorry. It seems like other people are able to get in. So if you're not able to get into the Slido, feel free to send me a private message and I'll be happy to read those out without sharing any names. So that way you can maintain your anonymity. I'm also going to pause really quickly and just look through the chat because I see there's a lot of chats coming through. I want to make sure I don't miss anything here. All right, so we got some commentary on what we shared so far. People are like, yep, there are ways to have difficult conversations, but we're not really good at it anymore. We've lost the art. Um, it looks like the code's not working for Slido, but the QR code does. Sorry about that. Technology is sometimes not amazing. And you know what? It's like I always say, the technology gremlins are out there. So if you're not able to get in with that actual code, so sorry, it looks like the QR code is working. But in any case, if you're not able to share directly, this is also just a moment for you to reflect to yourself. And especially if you might be watching this later on, because this is being recorded. Obviously, you're not in this live Slido. So just kind of reflect to yourself, like, how this has shown up for you specifically. And I see in the chat people are like, it's not a secure page. Technology is getting blocked. Yes, it happens, unfortunately. Anyway, thank you for those of you who were able to get and share. For those of you who weren't, again, feel free to send me a private message if you'd like me to bring that up and bubble up whatever you'd like to share, or just kind of take a moment and reflect to yourself. So it looks like we do have some mixes here. Some people are like, nope, I haven't had these experiences. Some people are like, yes, absolutely. So however this has shown up for you, you're all here today because you want to learn more about this topic and what this might look like, whether it's for you directly, for your colleagues, or how we can collectively move together and think about what a different version of being civil at work could be. So I'm going to move on and just kind of talk about one more thing I want to enter into the mix here, because the problem with having this more like sanitized definition of topics like or terms like civility, respect, etc., is when these terms start to translate into code for compliance. Another problem is, like I said before, whose norms get to define what is civil or uncivil or professional or unprofessional. What tends to get considered professional or civil tends to be defined by who is in charge. And that tends to be people who are from dominant groups. You got to think about context here, because if you don't know or agree with what one group says is civil, then you're automatically placed into this insubordinate category, right? Which I think we've seen with some of these answers that were shared just a minute ago. Um, Question for you all. What comes to mind when you see this picture that I put up on the slide? Anything kind of popping into mind? And I'm just curious because I've never used this picture in a webinar before. So I'm just wondering if the same things that I'm thinking about are what you might be thinking about. And this is where we'll see perhaps some age-related answers. So yes, Mary Poppins, absolutely, Rachel. Just be quiet and follow the reality you exist in. Oh, love that, Christina. Interesting take. Thank you for sharing that too. Let's see if there's anything else that comes through in chat. But yes, for me, I was definitely channeling Mary Poppins when I put this picture in here, because the difference is that, instead of having to swallow down that medicine with a spoonful of sugar, I want to make sure that we're talking about a world and a workplace where we're not judging folks based on cultural references, for example, or for different ways of being that might not align with what we've traditionally been taught that is the right or the wrong way to exist in a space like being at work. So, let's talk a little bit more about this. Whose norms define civility? We've already established people who are in dominant groups, people who are in charge. And so these are just a couple different labels for, uncivil behavior. So things like raising your voice, showing emotion, challenging authority, being direct or assertive, not smiling or softening your feedback. And who tends to get labeled with these types of descriptors? Well, it's women and non-binary folks, typically described in ways like, oh, being too emotional. It could be Black or brown employees being defined as being too aggressive. It could be neurodivergent people, so not a team player, doesn't get along with other folks. It could even be folks who are queer from LGBTQIA plus communities, being unprofessional in terms of how they're showing up at work. And I see in the chat, yes, nasty woman. We all have heard some of these labels, right? The key insight here is that when the bar for professionalism is built on dominant cultural norms, people who are outside of those norms are more likely to be judged, dismissed, or punished even for how they are just showing up as their authentic selves. And what civility can obscure are and kind of be a shield for almost are things like tone policing, avoiding hard, difficult conversations, suppressing dissent. It's enforcing comfort for those who are in power. So again, think about like who are we prioritizing here? It's penalizing those who have experienced justified anger, pain, harm. It reinforces those existing power imbalances that might be at play in your workplace dynamic. It silences marginalized voices and creates environments where only some emotions are allowed or acceptable. So, in general, instead of promoting respect, I find that traditional definitions of civility tend to really reinforce inequity in the workplace. And the question that I always come back to is, are we promoting civility or are we promoting silence? So, with that question in mind, who gets to speak and who gets heard? I want to talk a little bit about power now. Now, if you've been in any of my webinars or workshops in the past, you may have seen this image. It's one that I really love to come back to. It's a power wheel, or wheel of power unprivileged, rather. It's adapted by Sylvia Duckworth's work. And there's a lot of different versions of this image out there, or this framework out there. So you might have seen something similar, but maybe not exactly the same. But basically, the general framework is relevant across whatever image you're used to. So at the center of this wheel is power. And as we kind of go out to the outer edges of the wheel, we see that it's naming people from different identity groups that have less and less power and privilege. So as a quick example, if we look at body size as one example up here, so the identities that are closest to the center of power are folks who are slim, muscular. As we go out, we see that perhaps folks who have maybe some power, some privilege, but not a ton, are folks who are maybe too slim or small fat, mid fat. And then as we get out to the outer edges, we have folks who are large fat, etc. So you can see how this kind of goes around for all sorts of different identities around the wheel here. The reason I'm talking about power is because power influences who feels safe to speak up and who doesn't. It influences how people's words are received, and it can also turn assertiveness into leadership or into a problem. And so think about, and I've had this experience, I'm sure a lot of you may have had too, where the same kinds of behaviors are treated differently, received differently, talked about differently, depending on who the person that's exhibiting those behaviors might look like, show up like, what their identities are, what their experiences are. The playing field is just simply not always level, even as much as we'd like it to be or that we might hope it to be. So, what we see and how this kind of plays out in a workplace dynamic is an idea from perhaps a senior white man could be heard as strategic versus that same idea being shared from a younger Black woman might be labeled as disruptive. Emotional expression by one person could be seen as passion, by another person, a disruptive outburst, right? So things get treated and received differently. We also, again, go back to whose version of civility are we really defining and upholding? So, phrases like she's too emotional lead to the fact that we see women of color being dismissed at work. That was really aggressive. Direct communication being penalized, not always just for BIPOC folks, but definitely that's an identity group that we see this happening a lot in. Let's keep it professional, shall we? Queer expression being shut down. So there's more and more examples I could share, of course, but I think we've kind of all gotten the point here. And what I'd love you to think about is, was there a time where maybe you didn't speak up for some reason? What made you hold back? Because this is what happens when we have these differing versions of how we're showing up. We sometimes try to fit ourselves into this narrative, or we might look around and see how things are defined, how things are treated, and we might not want to rock the boat or become disruptive, even if we are not necessarily personally attacked or influenced or treated in a certain way by these norms, but we see that others in our working environment are. Now, I've talked a little bit about identity already. I want to kind of go a little bit deeper into that because identity shapes our perceptions, it shapes our voice. And this is an identity framework, which I really love. I'm not going to go deep into this, but basically, identities like race, gender, class, disability, neurodivergence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of that affects how we are seen and heard. So, for folks who are not in the typical dominant groups in whatever industry or organization you're working in, things like code switching, extra emotional labor, self-censorship often come up as coping tools for how to get by, how to not rock that boat, how to just survive, how to get ahead, etc. Feedback sometimes might come with a double standard. So again, you're too blunt, you're too passive, depending on what your identity is. And when we're talking about workplace dynamics or even biases that pop up at work, authority figures might consciously or unconsciously favor those who reflect back their own identities, their own communication styles or working styles, and marginalized employees are often asked to tone it down, be more patient, calm down, other phrases like that. So, the key thing here that I want to just keep us remembering is that civility without this kind of context ignores how the systems of power shape our interactions and our experiences at work. Whew. So I know that's a lot, and for some of you, that might be bringing up a lot. So let's just take a quick breath here because this is how it is for a lot of us right now and how it's been for a long time. But it doesn't mean that this is how it has to remain. So what I want to shift us into now is kind of a little bit of maybe like future thinking. I want us to start thinking about how can we redefine civility. I would love us to all take a moment and just imagine or reimagine what could civility look like, feel like, sound like in a more inclusive workplace, a workplace that we feel good in, that we all want to work in, that we want to sustain and grow in the future. What does that look like for you? What could that look like for you? And if you have some thoughts that are popping into your head right now, please feel free to either jot them down on the side or share them in the chat box. But as you're thinking, what could this look like for you? I'd like to share a little bit about what this looks like for me. So, if I'm thinking about using an equity lens and applying it to work with this terminology of civility, I'm thinking that true civility might mean things like I'm making space for that discomfort and that growth. Because, again, if you've ever been in one of my workshops, one of my favorite activities is to help people feel what discomfort could look like and turn it into something that's not necessarily bad, but just it's uncomfortable. And that's okay because that means that we're growing and we're stretching. So, how do we make space for that good, healthy discomfort? Are we listening across difference, even when it's hard, even when we might be hearing things that we don't like to hear or that make us question ourselves or re-examine what we're doing or how we're showing up? We're calling in and we're calling out with care. We're protecting the dignity of all, not just the comfort of some. And we're being willing to confront harm, not just smooth things over and keep the peace. I see in chat we've also got being really inclusive, being thoughtful. Yes, absolutely. So these are just some ways that we could think about redefining stability, but this is where we can really imagine what could it look like. And this is where there are no boundaries, right? But it's about taking the time to imagine that and then pulling that back into our daily lives. Because if we're trying to move from politeness to equity, we need to move from smoothing things over into how do we name hard truths. We need to move from staying neutral or taking a back seat to stepping forward, leaning in, taking a stand. We need to move from just being nice to really emphasizing justice and minimizing harm in the workplace. And so this is the real big question. It's a big one, right? Is how or what would it look like? What would change if we were able to redefine civility around inclusion, around honesty, around being accountable? And that's a big question. We're not going to answer it in our hour-long webinar today, but that's the question that I really want us to really chew on because that's the question that we all have the power to imagine. I'm going to put that in the chat just so folks have that. What would change if we redefine civility around inclusion, honesty, and accountability? And I see there's a couple more things coming through in chat. Let me just see what we have here. So some more imaginings are meeting folks where they're at, keeping our biases aside. For example, someone who shows up in bright, whimsical manners is not just being childish, they're being just bright and whimsical. I love that. Thank you for sharing that example, Rebecca. We've got also the demographics of people who are considered civil. So yes, how do we reimagine that? And again, perhaps in our reimagining, we don't even use this word civility. Maybe that doesn't serve us anymore. And if so, what do we want and how are we describing it? Maybe there's other words that we really want to lean into. So just some fun ways to kind of picture what could we work towards in the future. Now, I want to talk a little bit about purposeful civility. Oh, yes, and here's that question that popped up. So, how could the workplace change if we redefined it? But I want to talk about purposeful civility. And when I'm thinking about not just reimagining civility, but giving it a purpose, I want to value honesty. I want to value growth over comfort. I want to create space for that disagreement without punishing people. I want to center those who are most impacted by harm, not those who have the most comfort already built in for them. I want to align our behavior with equity and accountability. And I see there's much more coming through in chat. So let's see what else we have here. Bring more gratitude to an environment. Appreciate how these are practiced. We see that a ripple could start. We have that momentum where people start finding their own strength to attempt what they may have never attempted to before. That ripple effect spreads out from the workplace and beyond. Yes, I love that, Christina. And that's exactly it, right? A lot of times with these topics, they feel really big, and they are. But the reality is that even though we're trying to shift big meaty things that are in existence in our world, it starts with the smallest of motions or movements. And I, in my practice, have always really believed in the power of tiny, tiny, tiny shifts or moving the needle slightly will ultimately lead to larger shifts over time. And so just like throwing a rock in a pond, you see that that's just one action, one moment, but it has a long-lasting effect. And that's what we're really trying to do here. So here's what real civility could sound like. This is something that I was just imagining as I was thinking this through. So instead of saying something like, let's stay positive and not dwell on the negative, how about we reframe that by saying, let's name what's really going on so we can move forward. Here's another one. Let's not make this about race or gender. I want to understand your perspective. Can you tell me more? Because the realities are, while race and gender are examples of social constructs, they're not going away anytime soon. So instead of trying to dismiss them, ignore them, or bury them, let's talk about it. Let's try to understand. Let's be empathetic. You're being too emotional. It's okay to feel strongly. This matters. That one is huge for me because I feel like especially one group that gets penalized for showing emotion tends to be women or people who are women aligned in the workplace. And so when you cry or when you show emotion, it's seen as a bad thing. I don't know about you, but I have cried at work many times and it's always been an embarrassment. I've hidden in a bathroom, I've hidden it away, I've seen it in myself as a sign of weakness. But what if we reframed it and said, this shows passion, this shows that you're feeling strongly, it shows that you care, whatever it is, right? This matters to you. How if we reframed these moments, what could that have meant like in that own little ripple effect for our workplace careers, how we treat other people, how we manage people, how we work with people, etc. Here's another one. That's not very professional. What if you reframe that as saying something like, well, professionalism to me or to us means showing up with integrity and respect. Now, that reframe phrase could sound really different because that's where we're redefining what these words mean, right? And that redefinition could be really different from individual to individual, or even from organization to organization, from team to team, department to department. But this is where we get to redefine what it means. So just a couple different ways of thinking through how do we start to put in place our reimaginings? How do we take that conceptualism and bring it down into actual phrases or different ways of being and working in the workplace? There are, as I like to say, three R's of civility. One is recognize, notice whose voices are prioritized, whose voices are dismissed. Second R is reframe, in case you didn't get that loud and clear from what I've been talking about. Reframe, shift from tone to content, context, reframe as we just did a moment ago. Respond, speak up in ways that balance truth and inclusion. Because in order to create equity-rooted civility, I really believe that we must normalize discomfort and honest dialogue. We have to understand that impact outweighs intent. I always say intent is valid and important, and I want to recognize intent because if someone comes to me with ill intent, I need to know that and I need to recognize that, but I'm really addressing the impact. We need to hold ourselves and others accountable with compassion. We need to make space for multiple voices, all voices, not just the ones that are dominant or ones that are coming from dominant identity groups. And we need to really commit to learning, unlearning, and relearning along the way. So I see there's more chats coming through. Let me see what I've missed in chat. So we need to be thinking about accepting and encouraging diverse opinions and expressions. It provides more perspectives and available skills to solve and discuss problems. Absolutely, Rachel. Because again, if we're just hearing and kind of limiting ourselves to one viewpoint or one way of being, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. And again, each of you here today is coming from a different industry, a different background, different experiences, and the work that you're doing looks and is different. But if we're not opening ourselves up to different ways of thinking, of approaching a problem, of being with each other, then we're just limiting ourselves ultimately. Let's see what else we have here. We're human, even at work. We forget and create great shame around emotion at work. It's regrettable for all of us. Yes, we are human, right? And I think that I think a lot about my own workplace experiences and it is what it is. It shaped me. It's brought me to my work today. It's brought me to this literal webinar today, and it's made me who I am. But I do think sometimes about going back, especially when I was younger in my career and I had different experiences. I think about what could it have meant for me, even if it's just in my own personal emotional regulation or experiences. What could it have meant for me if I hadn't been taught that certain things were bad or shameful or less desired than, or if I had been treated as maybe not aggressive or, things like that, terminology like that, but passionate, right? Just little word choices like that can really impact people over time. And what we tend to see with research, especially, is that women, non-binary folks, people from Black or brown backgrounds tend to get labeled with these kinds of words even when that same sort of behavior in their white, typically male counterparts is labeled differently. And it does really create a different trajectory in someone's promotion rate, or for example, or how they grow in their careers over time. So really interesting questions for us to ponder. And especially for those of us who are in perhaps positions of managerial positions, leadership positions, maybe you oversee some folks, you're managing interns or folks who are younger in their careers or growing in their careers. This is a real opportunity for us to think about how are we either upholding this traditional definition of civility, or how are we using our own power and our own positionality to leverage some of what we've talked about in today's session. So I want to leave us with a bit of a quote here. This is from James Baldwin, and this quote I'm sure a lot of you have seen before. It's one of my favorites. He says, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and my right to exist." And obviously that's a big one to chew on, right? But I think it ties directly back to what we've been talking about today with civility around who gets to define things, who gets to deny of an experience or deny an expression of who somebody else is. And so this is something that I really came back to a lot as I was thinking about this topic and what this means for folks. So we talked about a lot so far. We do have some time for Q&A. And I know a lot of you shared questions in advance, which was awesome. So I have a ton of questions that I can go through, but I would love to pass it over to folks who are here right now and see if there are any questions in the virtual room, so to speak, before we get into questions that were shared in advance. So what we can do is you can either share your question in the chat box and I'll respond in as I see them pop up, or if you would like to unmute yourself and share your question verbally, just use the raise hand feature in Zoom on the bottom there, and I will be happy to call on you and have your voice be added into the mix. And so I've just updated the tool so that we can have folks unmute if you would like to share verbally. So give it a couple seconds. Oh, before we go into wrap up. Q&A. We'll just leave this quote up here. It's a good one. So it's good for us to rethink this and kind of get this in our minds before we get into it. All right. Any questions coming up for folks at the moment? And if you're like me and you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting to be put on the spot so quickly, I have some more wrap up to actually go through. So we have some more info to share before we kind of wrap. So if you're like, I need to think about it, I'm noodling on it, or I'm writing away, take your time. We have plenty of time. Okay, so how about this? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just share some final thoughts. Then I'm going to come back to the questions because, as I mentioned, I have a ton of questions that came through in the Eventbrite and in the sign up. So we'll have some stuff to go through, even if there's nothing coming through live. So if you are thinking about something, feel free to pop it in whenever works for you. But to quickly wrap up, this is just a couple final thoughts here on operationalizing civility. So if you're thinking about, okay, how do I bring this back to my workplace? Here's a couple tips that I pulled together. So think about developing, sharing, and iterating. So continuing to update, change, shift as needed. A shared definition of civility, a code of conduct, group norms. And this is where this can be something that you co-create with others at your organization. Make sure that you're condemning hate, violence, harassment, and discrimination. Those have no place in any workplace environment. Prioritize a respectful work environment. And again, think about how are you defining respect? What does that mean for you and your coworkers and your colleagues? And does that definition need to shift or change in any way? Acknowledge the differences that exist in your workplace in terms of the folks that you work with. Acknowledge power, acknowledge privilege. It's not necessarily something to be ashamed about. This is the world that we live in. This is what has been constructed for us. We need to recognize the current state of reality, the current situation, in order to think about how do we change or what do we want to change. Support challenging conversations without distracting the impact that it has on work. And so that's a tricky one because we don't want to necessarily have to abandon the work that we need to get done because work is always there. It will never go away. But how do we hold space for both the work and some of this work that we need to do with ourselves as well? Normalize feedback and accountability at all levels, not just some and not just one-way feedback. And that's another sort of little flag that comes up sometimes when we talk about civility. Oh, feedback is great, but only from me to you, not from you to me, right? So make sure that we're really thinking about how does this go back and forth as a two-way street across the board. And how do we hold ourselves accountable? So these are some questions for you all to think about in terms of how are you engaging in this kind of work, or what should you be thinking about, or could you be thinking about in the future? For example, how do I value diversity of thought and differing opinions? And I know diversity of thought is a code word and it kind of, can be coded for other things, but I want you to just again think about how do I define that terminology, or is that terminology I want to use? How do I encourage openness? How do I encourage honesty? How do I engage in empathetic listening? How do I engage in difficult discussions without judgment? Very hard to do. It takes a lot of work. Even people who are good at it, no one's perfect in this kind of work. Am I more civil at work or outside of work? And if so, why? There's a difference. Why? And this is one of my favorite images to use when I talk about accountability 101. In case anyone can't see it, it's got a broken egg and there's a couple of different choices underneath. First choice is I meant well. No. Second choice, that was not my intent. No. Third choice, I broke the egg. Yes. And the reason I love this is because for me, I'm a visual person. And so, it doesn't matter if we didn't want to or mean to break the egg. The egg is still broken at the end of the day. And, intent, like I said, it's important to recognize, but we have to address the impact. At the end of the day, the egg is still broken. All right. So, just some questions for thought. Going to come back to the Q&A. I'm going to just check to see if there's any questions that did come up in the chat that were related to content versus logistics. Yes, everyone will be able to get access to all this stuff afterwards. And if you're watching this, you already got access, so you already know that. All right, so I'm going to go through and just share a couple different questions that came through in advance. And then if anything else comes up for you live, feel free to pop that in. So, first question that came through was how to call someone out for being uncivil in a meeting. I'll put that in the chat just in case anyone needs to read that or if that's helpful for you. How to call someone out for being uncivil in a meeting. This is where you get to decide your approach because it's going to depend on a lot of factors. It's going to depend on things like does your organization have a shared, even if it's an unspoken or unwritten definition of civility, professionalism, things like that, right? And again, it may not be the perfect or the one that you like, but do you already have any kind of code of conduct or things that are acceptable or not acceptable? Other things contextually that it would be important to know would be, who is saying the thing that's being uncivil, and so do you have a relationship with them? Is there a positionality difference? Is there active harm that's being done, right? So those are all questions that might shift or impact how you might want to respond in the moment. What I typically would say is you get to decide, do you want to call someone in or would you want to call someone out? Calling someone in is going to be a little bit more of a gentler approach, maybe using humor, for example. So you could be saying something like, "Oh, Bob, that was a little disruptive what you just said," or "Oh, we don't talk like that here." Maybe on the golf course, or maybe in the parking lot, but not here. You can sort of be a little bit more gentle and just try to redirect and bring it back to where you want to go. Calling someone out is a bit more direct, especially if what was said was actively harmful, very disruptive, etc. You could say something like, "That's not acceptable. We need you to step outside," or "I need you to leave this virtual meeting for a minute," or "I need to talk to you elsewhere separately." What I always like to go back to in moments like this is you want to address what was said and the person who said it. And in the moment is great if you're able to. If you're not, then make sure you address it at some point, ideally not too long after what was said was said. But you also need to support and address everybody else who was in that meeting. So if there were other people who were on the receiving end or listening, you need to make sure that you're addressing it so that A, they know that this is not acceptable at your place of work. B, you're able to check in with them and see is there any further support, resources, anything that's needed on their part. And then that's where, again, if possible, addressing it in the moment during that meeting is really valuable and really helpful. It's not always possible, and again, it does depend on things like, if you're a brand new employee, if you're low level, it's your first day of work, and the CEO says something, that's going to be a different dynamic than if you've been at your place of work for a long time. Maybe that person reports to you, or you have a good relationship with them. That's going to be a different little bit of a dynamic there. All right, I see some more stuff come through. One person said, "This makes me think of psychological safety and civility place in the space. I work with leadership to embrace psychological safety. What are my feelings about psychological safety?" I think psychological safety is of utmost importance. I think it's really critical. And I think that it's something that we talk a lot about, and people don't always understand how to create a psychologically safe workplace that is psychologically safe for everyone and not just people who look a certain way or have a certain identity or tenure or whatever it might be, right? And we do a ton of work with our clients on psychological safety. So There are ways to quantify it and to identify behaviors, especially if you're in a leadership position. Everyone can practice psychological safety, I believe, in some way, even if you're not in a position of power. But especially if you're in a position of power, if you are managing, if you're leading, you have an extra responsibility and an extra way of really creating a space where people feel safe to speak up. If there's a mistake that's being made, how are we handling it? Things like that. So I am all for it. I think it has a lot of connection into what we're talking about today. Okay, let's see. What other questions do we have? Let me take a look at my notes here. All right. Next question. It's a little bit of a longer one. I'm going to pop this into the chat as well. This question is, I'm used to trying to find a nice way to say something that might be negative feedback. How do we get to a point where we are able to say things as they are and not worry about hurting people's feelings? The intent is not to hurt feelings, but the message of being nice seems to go too far. Yeah, this one can be tricky. And again, I think a lot of what was shared in this question are, elements of what we touched on in this webinar. So, we feel pressure to be nice. We're giving feedback that might be direct or it might be completely valid or warranted, but it might be received as being negative. And this is a tough one, right? Because I've been there myself. No one likes to get critical feedback. If you like getting critical feedback, let me know in the chat because I would love to chat with you more and learn your ways. But from my experience, nobody likes getting critical feedback. So how do we separate out that critical feedback from the pressure to be nice and give maybe um, less direct feedback or more sanitized feedback, or maybe not giving feedback at all? And so one way is going back to those R's of civility, that reframe R. That's one way that you could think about this. And so reframe feedback. And so I do this myself. When I talk about feedback, I always tell folks like you and my clients and other people that I work with, I always use this phrase that feedback is a gift. Now, the reason I say this phrase a lot is because I'm also reminding myself that feedback is a gift. And the reason is because when I get critical feedback, my immediate reaction, even after years and years of doing this kind of work and researching and teaching other people, my immediate reaction is still going to be defensiveness. But the difference is instead of allowing that defensiveness just pop out of me and push back, I have like a slight little check because I have this phrase that's in my head a lot. Feedback is a gift. I may not like the gift, I may not want the gift, but it is a gift because someone has taken the time and the effort to share it with me. So that could be one way of addressing this person's question. How do we reframe feedback from being a personal attack or really negative or it's got to be all nice to feedback is a gift. It's okay to have critical feedback. And this is where having that psychological safety, as the person mentioned earlier, or having open lines of communication, especially if it's, manager to direct report, are really, really important. And you could even be very transparent about this and you could have a conversation. And one way of entering into a conversation that would align with this question would be going to the person and saying something like, hey, I know we're going to talk about this project that you delivered. I have some feedback for you. Just a heads up, it is a little bit more critical. I don't want to do you the disservice of not giving you this critical feedback, but I want to give you just advance notice because the intent here is not to be mean or to disparage what you've done, but I want to help you be better. I want to help this project or whatever it is be better. So that's what my goal in providing this feedback is for. That's obviously, easier said than done, right? We're talking in a bubble here, in the moment, depending on your relationships, how this, experiences or interactions have gone in the past with people, how you feel, how you're showing up at work that day, what's going on in the larger world. All of that's going to also impact. Some of us may not be in a space or in a workplace where we can have that kind of more open conversation. Some of it may take practice, but just again, rethinking how do we reframe this kind of a thing because we want to make sure that we don't want to hurt feelings, of course. And sometimes it's just about saying, this is not to hurt your feelings. This is to help you grow. This is to help you be better. Just saying that over and over again can be, I think, a little bit helpful in these kinds of dynamics. But if you have something else to offer, or if you would approach it differently, let us know in chat, of course, because I'm just one person. I'm not perfect. I'm not the end all be all when it comes to this kind of stuff. So that's my viewpoint, but you may have some more to offer into the conversation. All right, let's see what else is coming through in chat. This person said, my mentor helped me reframe by telling me, if you're not giving your direct report this feedback, you're stealing his ability to grow because he won't know otherwise. Oh, I love that, Stephanie. That's so real, right? Like exactly that. You're stealing the opportunity, the ability to grow. So great example of reframing. Thank you for sharing that. Let's see, Rachel says, sometimes I try to, I lost the chat. Sometimes I try to avoid saying, when you did this, blah, 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 and instead say, when this happened as a result, blah, blah, blah. Absolutely. Another great way of reframing. There's so many amazing frameworks and models out there, especially if we're talking about feedback. For example, a personal favorite of mine and ours at Inclusion Geeks is the SBI model, Situation, Behavior, Impact. And there's a ton of other different models out there, which are also really great. I like the SBI model in particular because it does two things. First, it helps the person delivering the feedback prepare and feel a little bit more comfortable with what they're going to say instead of just going into the conversation. And the second reason is that by nature of how it's structured, you talk about what happened, the behavior that was demonstrated, and then the impact on you or on other folks or on the business because of that behavior. So it creates a little bit of space so that it's not just you messed up, you did this, but when you delivered the presentation, there were spelling mistakes and blah, 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 blah. So it just creates a little bit more space. And so that hopefully helps the person on the receiving end of that feedback not feel like it's a personal attack on them. Of course, easier said than done. It's not always easy, but that's the intent behind it. Okay. So, and then this person said, well, isn't delivering feedback in this way, not really getting at the issue? So again, this is where you're not discounting the issue, you're not hiding it. It's just about how are you entering into that conversation and how are you delivering that feedback. So the person who did the thing or exhibited the behavior is still part of that, and it's sort of like understood as opposed to you messed up. So it's just again reframing that delivery and reframing some of the words there. Okay, there's another quote here that was shared. This is from a therapist. Something like, the people that are often in therapy are, in fact, not the ones that are needing it. The people causing the harm are not the ones seeking therapy. Individuals trying to learn and overcome the damage created by these individuals are the ones trying to learn and grow. Yes, of course, overly simplistic and generalized. How do we encourage that the individuals who perpetuate these continued problematic standards in workplaces and beyond? Um, how do we encourage them to come to these kinds of webinars or think about these type of topics? Absolutely. That's an age-old question. There's not like a great easy answer for that necessarily, but what I will say is that um, there, I believe, is a real impact when even if you're not getting everyone who needs to be part of the conversation in the conversation, the fact that other folks, whether it's those who are being harmed or impacted, or people who are curious or who want to be allies or who just want to learn something more, or maybe stumbled on a webinar like this by accident, the fact that we are here discussing this stuff and talking about it, we are all individually and collectively able to make those ripple effects, right? And so the more that we spread out and the more that we show up and the more that we continue to share our learnings, our reimaginings, our viewpoints, the more that's going to help impact the folks who need to really be part of these conversations too. And a lot of times it's about trying to meet people where they're at. And my favorite thing to say in that regard is I want to meet someone where they're at and then bring them along. So it's about figuring out how do we, encourage people to even listen, because if we can't have people listening, then there's no point in even trying. But it's about really figuring out, can we at least get folks who should be part of these conversations at least receptive to hearing a different perspective? That's obviously pretty theoretical. It's pretty hard, but that's lies at the crux of everything that we're doing here. Okay, let's see what else we have here in chat. I may have missed something, but I think that's most of it. Awesome. So actually, that's great. We have just 1 minute left. So if there are other questions, feel free to follow up with us afterwards. But really quickly, I want to share this before people start to hop. Let us know what your feedback is for this topic. If you'd like to hear more, there's a QR code on the screen, and you can go ahead and grab that. and share your thoughts with us. We also have a few things coming up. So we have a webinar next month all about navigating change with empathy and inclusion. We'll be talking about a concept called change management. In November, we'll be talking about understanding cultural differences. And in December, we're doing a public workshop, which is actually tapping into a lot of what we talked about here today, which is going to be all about reimagining the future of work. So if you liked what we did a little bit of here today, if you want to get into that more, if you want to think about what could it look like if we were in a different workspace, if we were in a different world, definitely sign up for that workshop in December. I think it's gonna be a really fun time. And I don't know if it's announced yet, but we also have an upcoming workshop in January that I believe is coming up soon, in terms of being live on our website, which is going to be all about facilitation 101. So if you want to learn how to facilitate some of these kinds of conversations, if you like what I've done here today, definitely keep an eye on our website for that as well. And yes, as Rachel said, that's going to be up on our website soon, so keep an eye out for that. Finally, we do have a podcast where Rachel and I talk about some of these topics in much more detail, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. And if there are other questions that you didn't get a chance to get answered, feel free to reach out to us. You can email us at facilitators@inclusiongeeks.com. Thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and appreciate you all being here today.